I started the night shift because nobody else wanted it, and because the building paid a little more after midnight, the kind of extra money that makes you ignore the way a place feels when it gets quiet. The first thing I noticed about the job was that the building never truly went silent, even when every office was locked and the lights on the upper floors were supposed to be off. There was always a low humming somewhere in the walls, like ventilation that breathed too slowly to belong to a machine. On my first night, I sat at the security desk watching the camera feeds, 20 small screens glowing in a dark room that smelled faintly like old carpet and printer ink. Around 1:17 a.m., one of the monitors flickered and showed the long hallway outside conference room B. Nothing strange at first, just fluorescent lights and beige walls. But something about the image made me lean forward. The hallway lights were switching off one at a time from the far end toward the camera. Not quickly, not like a power failure, but slowly, as if someone invisible was walking toward the camera and flipping the switches behind them. When the final light went out, the hallway monitor went completely black. I checked the system logs and it showed nothing unusual. 5 minutes later, the lights came back on all at once. I wrote it down in the logbook because the training manual said to document electrical irregularities. The next night, the same thing happened again at exactly 1:17 a.m. Except this time, one of the lights stayed off. The dark patch remained halfway down the corridor like a missing tooth in a row of bright squares. I remember staring at that dark space on the screen and thinking that the hallway looked deeper than it should, as if the missing light had created extra distance. On the third night, my supervisor left a note taped beside the monitors. It said simply, "If hallway B loses a light, do not go check it until 1:30. I assumed it was a maintenance issue, but I followed the instruction anyway, because security work is mostly about routine. At 1:17, the lights went out again in that slow, creeping pattern. And this time, 2 lights stayed off. The hallway on the camera looked longer than I remembered from walking it earlier. The darkness between the lights seemed to stretch farther than the floor plan suggested. At 1:29, I stood up with my flashlight, but something stopped me from opening the door to check the corridor. It was the faintest sound coming from the monitor speakers. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps echoing through the camera's microphone from somewhere in that dark section of the hallway. At exactly 1:30, the steps stopped and the lights came back on. When I checked the corridor in person, it looked perfectly normal, except the light bulbs that had gone dark were warm, as if they had been recently switched off by hand. I asked the day guard about it the next morning, and he shrugged in the tired way of someone who has decided not to ask questions anymore. He told me there were a few rules that night guards eventually figure out for themselves. One of them was to never interrupt the hallway between 1:17 and 1:30. I laughed at first because it sounded like superstition, but the next week I discovered another rule. Around 2:40 a.m., every night the elevator camera would show the doors opening on the basement level, even though the building had no basement. The panel clearly said B1. The doors would slide open slowly, revealing a dim concrete corridor that didn't exist on the building plans. The camera would hold that view for about 10 seconds before the doors closed again, and the panel returned to showing floor 1. The first time I saw it, I rewound the footage 3 times because I thought it was a glitch. On the fourth night, it happened again, and I noticed something in the elevator reflection on the metal walls. A figure standing inside the elevator just outside the camera's frame. Not moving. Just the faint outline of someone facing the doors. When the doors closed, the reflection disappeared. I reported it to my supervisor, expecting concern, but he just added another note to the desk beside the monitors. If the elevator opens to B1, do not call the elevator. Wait 10 minutes. By that point, I'd started keeping my own notebook because the building seemed to operate on rules nobody wanted to officially explain. The hallway lights, the basement that wasn't there, the way the ventilation hum sometimes turned into something that sounded almost like whispering if you listened too long. Nights passed and the patterns continued. The hallway went dark at 1:17. The elevator opened to B1 around 2:40. Sometimes the security cameras would freeze for a few seconds, and when they came back, the chairs in empty offices had moved slightly closer to the doors. The changes were always small enough to dismiss, but they kept happening. One night I noticed a sticky note on the inside of the desk drawer. The handwriting wasn't mine or my supervisor's. It said, "If you see someone on camera 12 after 3 a.m., do not rewind the footage." Camera 12 showed the lobby entrance, a glass door facing the parking lot. Most nights nothing happened there, just occasional headlights from passing cars and the reflection of the building lights in the glass. But at 3:06 one morning, the camera flickered and a person appeared standing outside the door. They were perfectly still facing the camera, but the parking lot behind them looked darker than usual, as if the lights had dimmed around that spot. I waited for them to move or knock, but they didn't. The timestamp ticked forward second by second while the figure remained motionless. After about a minute, the person slowly tilted their head to the side. That small movement sent a strange feeling through my chest, the kind of instinct that tells you something is wrong before you understand why. I remembered the note telling me not to rewind the footage, so instead I looked away from the screen for a moment. When I looked back, the lobby was empty. The door sensor never triggered. No entry was logged. The camera simply showed an empty parking lot again. The following night, the same thing happened at 3:06, except this time the figure was closer to the door. I could see the outline of a security uniform, my uniform, the shape of the shoulders, the reflective strip on the chest. The figure outside looked like a guard standing exactly the way I was sitting inside. I forced myself not to rewind the footage because the rule in the drawer suddenly felt important. At 3:07, the figure outside leaned forward slightly toward the camera, as if trying to look through the glass. Then the screen flickered and the person was gone. That was the moment the job stopped feeling routine. After that night, I began noticing things that had probably been happening from the beginning. The hallway camera sometimes showed doors that were supposed to be locked, standing slightly open. The elevator panel occasionally displayed floors higher than the building had. And every once in a while reviewing the camera feeds, I would catch a glimpse of a security guard walking through the building where no guard should be. The figure always wore the same uniform I did, but the camera angle never showed the face. One night around 4:10, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside the security office, even though the cameras showed the hall was empty. The steps stopped right outside the door and stayed there for almost 30 seconds before continuing down the hallway toward the elevators. I checked the monitors and saw nothing moving, but the elevator camera showed the doors opening a moment later, as if someone had stepped inside. The panel lit up with B1 again. I never called the elevator after that. Weeks passed, and the patterns became familiar in the same way storm clouds become familiar when you live somewhere that rains every afternoon. I knew when the hallway lights would fade. I knew when the elevator would open to the non-existent floor. I knew the lobby camera would show someone standing outside at 3:06. What I didn't understand was why the changes kept getting closer to the security desk. One night the hallway lights didn't stop at 2 bulbs. They kept going until the entire corridor outside the office went dark. The camera feed showed a long tunnel of shadow stretching right up to the security door. I listened to the speakers and heard those same slow footsteps moving through the darkness. The steps came closer and closer until they stopped right outside the door. The handle didn't turn. Nothing knocked. But I felt a presence on the other side, like someone standing inches away from the metal. At exactly 1:30, the lights came back on. The hallway was empty. After that night, another rule appeared taped beside the monitor. If the hallway goes completely dark, do not open the security door until the lights return. Nobody signed the note. The handwriting looked similar to the message in the drawer. I began to wonder how many guards had worked this desk before me, and how many of them had left these instructions behind. The strangest discovery came during a routine check of the camera archive. I scrolled back through weeks of footage from the lobby entrance trying to see if the 3:06 visitor appeared every night. The recordings confirmed that the figure had been showing up long before I started working there. Sometimes far from the door, sometimes close enough that the reflection of the building lights touched the shoulders. But one recording from months earlier made my stomach tighten. The camera showed the person outside turning slightly so their face was visible in the glass reflection. It was me. Not exactly me as I looked then, but unmistakably the same face, the same uniform. Standing outside the door at 3:06 a.m., looking into the building as if trying to see the guard sitting at the desk. I checked the timestamp again and again because it was dated 3 months before my first shift. I closed the recording and stared at the live monitor feed. The building was quiet except for the low breathing sound in the ventilation. The time read 3:05. I watched the lobby camera as the seconds ticked forward. The parking lot was empty at first. Then at 3:06, the image flickered and a figure appeared outside the door, standing perfectly still, facing the camera. The person slowly lifted their head, and for a moment I had the unsettling feeling that they were looking directly at me through the screen. I didn't rewind the footage. I didn't open the door. I just sat there watching the monitors until the figure disappeared and the parking lot returned to normal. The strange part is that after months of working the night shift, I've stopped feeling afraid of the patterns. The rules make the building predictable in a quiet way. The hallway lights go out at 1:17. The elevator opens to a floor that shouldn't exist. Someone in my uniform appears outside the lobby door every night at 3:06. I follow the rules and nothing terrible happens. But sometimes when the building gets very quiet and the ventilation hum drops into that slow breathing rhythm, I catch myself wondering something I can't quite shake. If the figure outside the door is me, then who exactly is sitting at the security desk watching the cameras? And which one of us is inside the building?